This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Welcome back to Beyond the Big Screen, where your two favorite detectives, Mustache Chris and Frank, are on the case today. On today's podcast, we're going to be tackling episodes 6 and 7. If I had to describe 6, I would use the words oppressive and depressive. Would you say that sounds accurate to describe episode 6?
Yeah, I think that applies. I think episode 6, I would subtitle episode 6, The Second Downfall of Marty Hart.
Yeah. And I guess you could add Rust in there too, depending on how you look at it. For episode 7, I would describe it as time heals some wounds and validation. These two episodes are quite a departure in terms of style and tone from the previous 2 episodes that we did, but I have to say in many ways episode 7 is probably one of my favorites, if not my favorite episode in the series. Frank, why don't you give us your quick thoughts on these 2 episodes before we start diving into them?
I like them a lot. I mean, it's so hard to say, oh, this is my favorite episode, because as soon as I do that, another episode is the greener grass, and I'm like, oh, but this was so good for this reason. And it's really tough. But I liked episode 6 because it closed the door on 2002. It finished out all of the past. And then we knew at that point that episodes 7 and 8 were going to be about the present and resolving this mystery. And then, so I liked that. I liked the Maggie interviews, that they did. Those were a new sort of twist a little bit because to me, she was always, the third billing, of all the characters. I mean, I think that's pretty, much who her character was. She was the number one support character to the 2 main characters. And now she's getting the same treatment, stare into the camera and answer the cops' questions deal. And she just handled it magnificently. And I thought it was interesting, the choice that she made to give them nothing. And so, maybe it's the downfall of Marty Hart, but it's also the idea of loyalty. Like you're loyal to what you know until you know better. Like if she knew enough about what was going on and she had all the evidence in front of her and she started to believe maybe Rust could be the killer, she might have helped them. But she didn't have any of that. And so instead of being loyal to the institution, represented by Parthenon and Gilbo, by them asking her questions and such, she stuck to her guns. She was loyal to her ex-husband and or to Rust, And I don't know if some of that ends up being out of guilt for what she did with Rust, because I think she probably harbors some, because she knows in one way what she did was wrong. So I liked episode 6 because it closes all that out. It shows the downfall of Marty again, that he just can't help himself. He still hadn't evolved. And then episode 7 is just fantastic. I mean, seeing Marty and Rust together again, seeing how the ways in which Marty has changed over that time period is great. Has one of my favorite lines of the series in it. And it ends on a great note with them on the boat, and then we get the reveal of the lawnmower man. So yeah, I understand why you like episode 7 so much. But as soon as I say that's my favorite episode, I'm going to be like, oh man, but that opening episode was so good. Or, oh man, the end of that 3rd episode with the image of Reggie Ledoux, freeze frame at the end there with that chilling line that Rust gives about, like, most dreams, there's a monster at the end, I mean, there's so many good moments. It's hard to pick, but they definitely propel the story forward into the present day here. By the end of season 6, we're not looking back, and season 7, it's really propels things forward.
Yeah, so I'll give us a quick overview of episode 6, and we'll just kind of get into the meat and potatoes of the episode. In 2002, Rust links a series of missing persons to the Tuttle-funded schools. A former pastor in Tuttle's Ministries claims Tuttle covered up child molestation.
And how good was that actor who played Tuttle in this episode? I mean, you remember him, of course, from the earlier one, like episode 2 or whatever it was. But, he's got that smile on his face that has no warmth at all. It's just all fake smile, but he's good at it. And he tries to act so solicitous and helpful. I mean, I thought the guy carried it off really well. What do you think?
I thought he was brilliant. And you mentioned like the fake smile. I've unfortunately met far too many people like that in my life, where it's like they're smiling and they know exactly what to ask you. Like I'll have like people, I'm not going to say names, and be like, "Well, how are the Leafs doing?" or something. I know for a fact they don't care at all, but they're just asking me because they like heard from somebody that I like the Maple Leafs, and it's like, oh, they're doing great, but you know that they don't.
or they're playing the odds that some Canadian from Ontario might like the Leafs. I'd say you got a 7 in 10 shot there, don't you?
He perfectly captures that idea, that feeling of like a guy is like, yeah, if you weren't like observant, you would think like, oh yeah, he seems like a nice guy, right? And then, but as soon as you kind of get to know that type of person, even just a little bit, or somebody like Russ, who's like very observant, knows right away that this guy's, there's nothing real about him.
And there's so much cunning malevolence in his eyes. You can tell if somebody's smile is real because it warms their eyes. It softens their eyes. You can tell. It takes a real talented person to fake that. And he, that character doesn't pull it off. Now that actor pulls off exactly what he was going for, I think. And that's this just, there's like veiled evil in his eyes essentially while he's talking to Russ. So that was a cool scene. I really dug that scene.
So yeah, and then continue on. Bledew's surviving victim, the little girl from 95. Russ interviews her, and she goes into basically a catatonic or a psychotic episode when he starts talking about the giant man with the scars. Tuttle complains to the police department following a tense meeting with Rust, who has been warned to cease his investigation and is suspended from duty. Marty is recognized by a store employee, Beth, who happens to be one of the former underage prostitutes who had kept Doria's diary at the ranch back in 95. This is the girl that Marty put a down payment on, as Russ pointed it out, and we'll get into it. I guess Russ can also predict the future. They start an affair after, and Maggie discovers the new affair. She tempts a drunk Russ with sex, and Russ has sex with her. After she tells Marty about it, he and Russ fight in the police station parking lot. Russ quits the police force immediately after the fight. In 2012, Papa Nia and Gilbo interview Maggie, who deflects their questions. Marty walks out of his interview in response to Papa Nia and Gilbo direct accusations against Russ. Russ seeks out Marty, and they agree to meet and talk.
And Marty pulls out his gun and checks to make sure it's loaded before he agrees to follow Rust. So they're still keeping alive the idea. And in fact, this whole episode, if I wasn't subtitling it, the second downfall of Detective Marty Hart, another good subtitle might be, the exploration of Rust as the killer, or the exposure of their theory. I don't know. I'm sucking on subtitles today, but you get the point that, they really were. This was the episode where they really, really worked on convincing the viewer that it was a possibility. And having Marty have some doubt, I think, is the smartest thing that they did to show us that. I mean, showing Rust around the crime scene and stuff, I don't think for the viewer, having watched him go through all the investigations that he went through, all the things he did during those investigations, I don't think they'd find that odd at all. It was right in his wheelhouse to be interested in something like that and to take action to gain knowledge. We know he does that. But when we see Marty wonder, and we know how well Marty and he know each other, that to me was the biggest thing that would make somebody go, oh, shoot, maybe there is something to this. I'm going to have to withhold judgment on this. Even Marty thinks it's a possibility. And so I think that was brilliantly done because, all the other stuff that Papania and Gilbo were doing, presenting as evidence, I think they're not dumb for thinking it was evidence, because they don't have the background that we do as the viewer, but it didn't convince me as the viewer the first time I watched it. And I find it even less convincing on rewatches. Makes sense that they would think so, of course, but from the viewer's standpoint, it's when Marty shows some doubt that makes me arch an eyebrow and go, well, let's see where this goes.
Yeah, so I guess I'll talk about probably one of my favorite sequences in this episode is when Russ decides to go talk to the tent revival minister from episode, I believe it was episode 2, was it not? Or was it episode 3?
I think it was 3 because it wasn't at the end of 2 where they find the burnt out church and then they go to talk to them in the very next episode. So I think it was 3. An interesting point here to make before we dive into this scene is Rust has evolved a little bit since 95, where he was not, like, his interviews were all about facts. And if you notice in this interview that you're about to talk about, one of the things, he seems to be caring more about the people as well. Not maybe caring, but being interested in, at least. Like, he asked this guy, why'd you leave the ministry? What did you do? Why did you stop the revivals? Like, why did you leave the ministry? That's a good question. And he gets some information out of that. It was about obtaining intelligence or information. But why'd you quit the revival? That was more of a like later on when he asks Marty, how have you been besides work? It's like in 2012, it's like he's starting to develop a little bit of humanity, and like he's making more eye contact than he used to in this time period. His gestures and his body language are more open, not dramatically so, but noticeably upon rewatch. It's one of the things that I noticed. So, that warmth, comparatively speaking, I think really helps make this a good scene. What was it about the scene that made it like one of your favorites?
Well, before we kind of get into it, it's funny that you say that, because I read a couple of just people's like live reactions to this episode, like leading up to us recording the podcast. And a lot of people said that, this is when Russ started not caring at all. And he just became even more semi-sociopathic, and I didn't get that impression at all. I think that's people...
Quite the opposite.
Yeah, I think that's people reading into, how they would react in situations that Russ does in this episode, but I don't think they're really understanding what Russ is actually trying to do here. But I mean, that's a side note. I'm going to get into it a little bit, especially when he interviews the victim at the Reggie Ledoux's compound. But before I jump into that, I want to talk about his interview with the tent revival minister, Joe Thoreau. Is that how you pronounce it?
I'm not sure. I don't know. I mean, you're the Canadian. There's more French influence up there than down here. But I mean,
I'm going to say
Thoreau, Thuriot.
I'm going to say Thoreau. That's how I'm going to pronounce it. So you guys can correct my terrible pronunciation later if it's wrong. I think they only ever mention his name like once or twice in the entire show, right? I literally knew him as the tent revival minister.
Yeah.
That's how.
Yeah.
So Russ goes to interview him, and he wakes him. He's actually waking him up. And he's basically kind of like a drunk stupor. Russ says, it's a little early to be hitting the bottle, isn't it, minister, or whatever? And he sits down and starts talking to him. And you can tell he's drinking from a flask. He's half in the bag. He's basically become
drinking from a coffee cup.
Sorry, yeah, from a coffee cup. He's become an alcoholic. You can tell that whatever has happened from 95 to this time period is completely kind of broken this man. It's understandable once we kind of get into the details. Russ starts asking him, why'd you leave the ministry, right? And he says, well, politics and bureaucracy and all of that. And then Russ takes the coffee cup away from him and says, why don't you tell me the truth?
How astute is that too, for Russ to just be so dialed into when somebody's lying to him? I mean, you get good at it because people lie to you all the time when you're in that job, and you learn tells, and you can just, and what makes sense and what doesn't and so forth. But for him to take away the coffee cup and then look at him and say, don't lie to me. And it's just, and it's quiet, but it's a very powerful interview tactic that he does. And later on, when he starts giving him information that's true and sensitive, what does he do? gives him back the coffee cup, gives him back his booze, So just cool talent from the tax man.
Yeah. Well, and so Joe ends up telling him about what happened. So, while he was working at the Tuttle schools, part of their work when he was going to school to become, like a better minister, learning church history, church theology, yada, 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 they had to do custodian work, right? Which is, you have to, clean the garbages, vacuum, all that type of stuff, right? I guess it was like a program, maybe help lower their tuition or what have you. And he knocks over a book while in the library from a very obscure mystic. I actually looked up, I can't remember the mystic's name right now, but I actually looked up if this was an actual mystic. No, apparently it's just made up. Like, it's not a real person. I was like, oh man, I was hoping it would have sent me down a rabbit hole to see what the
you go down a rabbit hole. That's weird.
And no, they just made it up for the show. I don't know. They should have just used a real mystic. I don't know. Like, there's a lot of really weird mystics out there.
That surprises me that it's a fictional mystic.
But what ends up spilling out of the book is pictures of young children in various states of undress that look like they're drugged up on LSD. He describes them as like kind of sleeping, and there's men there. And then he just kind of stops talking about, what else was going on in those pictures. And Rust doesn't pry for any more details because Rust already knows, right? He invaded the compound. He saw what Reggie and those guys were doing to those two little kids. And he talks about how he goes to the head of the Tuttle Ministries and shows them the pictures and go, like, I was cleaning up and I found this in the library. Like, what's going on here? And the school administration ends up accusing him of planting said pictures, and it basically went nowhere. And it was at that point, I guess, he realized he didn't want to be a minister anymore. He didn't believe in God anymore because of what happened in terms of not being able to get any justice for these kids.
Do you think he didn't believe in God anymore? I don't know if I would go that far. I think his faith in organized religion was shaken beyond repair. But I mean, he went and did the tent ministries after that. So, I mean, I don't know that he stopped. I mean, I think he's having a crisis of faith now when he's talking to Russ in 2002. But I think in 95, he was still a believer. And so rather than his faith in God, I think what really happened here was his faith in the institutions that, surround the religious experience or whatever. That's just my thought. I mean, do you think he lost his faith in an actual God when that happened at the seminary?
No, I think I got my timelines mixed up there. Like he and then he describes about how at the tent revivals got robbed a couple of times.
Right.
Plus the pictures and no justice coming to these kids, and also being accused of planting these pictures and being involved in the horrible things that went on. And then I think over a period of time, he slowly stopped believing. Like, he probably has like one of the more powerful lines in the entire series where he says, silence is the closest thing to God. I think that's supposed to be something that Russ can really understand in terms of like absolute silence. When does absolute silence happen? It's when you die, right? And there's nothing there. There's nothing left. And I think he's just waiting to either do it himself, or he's just waiting to die at this point. Like this people always talk about how life failed them. And a lot of the times I look at people and I go, no, you decided to start drinking. You decided to do this. You decided to cheat on your wife. You decided, to start lying, yada, yada, yada. You decided to quit this job. This guy did nothing wrong. And I always get like super emotional, like almost teary eyed when I'm watching this guy. He did the right thing almost virtually every step of the way. He was a man of God. He wanted to help people. And even you yourself, you mentioned in episode 3, like when they show up and the people at his ministry were helpful to Russ, helpful to Marty, unlike everybody else at that point leading up to the case.
Closest thing to cooperation that they had encountered to that point. There are no toolbox wax necessary to elicit information at that scene.
And this guy, he's taking like the lowest of the low of society, and he's whatever, you can say whatever you want, like, oh, it's all made up, it's whatever. You know, he gave these people hope. He gave these people a purpose. He was trying to, from the bottom of his heart, trying to help people. And what did life give him? Get accused of being part of a pedophile ring and having his tent ministry stolen from.
Well, see it covered up, too.
Yeah.
Nothing done. I think you could, as an individual, you could look at that seminary thing and you could say, well, that's an isolated incident. Those are certain people. I just won't be affiliated with them. And then you go out and do your tent ministry, and then, church gets burned down, and the tent ministries, toward the end there got vandalized and stuff too. And, when you get the same result from multiple people in multiple places, you start to think either it's me or it's people, but either way, it's a more complete problem. It's not isolated to just one event or one location or whatever. And I had some thoughts about this. One thought I had while we were talking that I didn't consider while I was watching it was, if these vandalizations that occurred, could those have been done by the Tuttle folks? Could they have sent people to do it? Like, this is a guy who found these pictures and then quit. Let's keep an eye on him because he might run his mouth, and so let's burn down the church and make him move on. Maybe he'll leave Louisiana, and nope, he's doing tents now. Well, let's take care of that, but let's be smart about it and do it over time. I'm not saying that is what happened, but it occurred to me, since, this is a huge conspiracy show. There's all kinds of conspiracies happening. Maybe that's what ran him out. But I agree with you. He's a tragic figure. And it's interesting. You interpreted him saying, the closest thing to God is silence, as meaning death, basically, which I think is an absolutely valid interpretation. I took it differently when I watched it, though, because he says before that, all my life, I wanted to be closer to God. And I believe him. I think he's telling the truth. I think he's absolutely sincere. And then he says the closest thing to God is silence, which to me means nothing. And I mean, I think he just basically, you said what he said probably appealed to Rust's philosophy, and I think you're right. But I think he basically just made a case for atheism, essentially. I think by saying silence, he's like, I reached out to God and there was nothing there. That's the closest I could get. And so either interpretation could be right, could be wrong, could both be correct, could both be wrong. Either way, it shows what nuanced writing is going on in this series. And I understand why you like this scene so much. I like it too. The acting is just excellent. The blocking, like with the taking of the cup and giving it back and things like that. The way he so casually, lights his cigarette and spits out a piece of tobacco and stuff like that. And I mean, that actor just did a fantastic job. He still has the same sideburns as he did in 95. I noticed. Great scene. It's an underrated scene, I think.
It's the one that hits home to me the most, I guess, because somewhat of my religious persuasion. And I've seen people like that where legitimately it's difficult to watch somebody and see that life failed them. They're just kind of going through the motions, which is what Joe's doing. Maybe we'll talk about it in the last episode where, the truth of what everything that happened came out, and maybe Joe turns it around. Maybe, God did hear him. I don't know. That's what I would like to think it did.
Yeah, or maybe all he still hears is silence. Again, the thing about great art is that it can be interpreted or filtered through a lot of different things for different people. And that's, what I think is happening here. I do like a lot the fact that he helped. Rust wasn't going to keep his booze from him forever. I mean, he could have waited him out. I think he wanted to help. He had his own natural defenses against it for whatever reasons, but he really didn't take a whole lot of prodding to reveal the truth. And I think that was admirable. Again, Rust does a good job, particularly post 95, in getting people to talk. I mean, there's a scene later on when he's talking to the male prostitute, about what happened to him as a kid, and he drew him out too and got him to talk about some very powerful and disturbing things. Of course, that's the next episode, but Rust's interview skills in getting people to confess, were great and fun to watch, a little disturbing sometimes, but they clearly translate to getting witnesses to be willing to tell their stories too. And this is a case where he didn't have to work super hard, but he just had to be a little bit insightful. And I'd argue a little bit more empathetic than Rust in the past, which shows some growth on his part.
I think what a lot of people fail to see in Rust is he cares. He generally does care.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like a lot of people think he's this idea, like he's this nihilistic guy, even though he in his in their defense, he spouts this type of philosophy that, why would anybody care about anything? But the reality is he feels really bad with what happened to this minister.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're in a second, we're going to talk about him visiting the psych ward. I think one of the reasons why people are willing to open up to Russ is he generally does care, but at the same time, he's not.
They can sense that empathy.
Yeah, he's not going to lie to you he's going to tell you the truth as he sees it, and people interpret that as like, oh, that's like being unsympathetic or unfeeling. It's like, well, no, actually, that's probably the best thing you can do in those circumstances, is because you're not telling somebody the truth, and how are they going to be able to change their course in life or change their outlook. That's the way I always interpreted Rust, and I think a lot of people don't get that part of the character, the highly empathetic aspect of his character. I think that's why Maggie very early on kind of gravitated towards him, because Marty says stuff and he seems like he's the empathetic guy, but in reality it's actually Rust that deeply cares about the people around him.
Yeah, there's a line from the Song of Ice and Fire, the series that Game of Thrones is based on. I don't know if it made it into the show or not, but there's a line in there that words are wind. And my wife was fond of saying, that those are just words, that when people say certain things, but they don't back it up with their actions. And Rust is a person for whom, Marty is a person for whom words are wind, and Rust not at all. I mean, he cares, but he's not going to coddle you with a comfortable lie. He's going to tell you the truth or nothing at all. And so I think, I'm not all woo woo of a person here, but I think anybody would agree that human energy is a thing. Like, when you walk into a room and people are all mad, you can feel that energy crackling. When people are festive, you can feel that. I mean, if you've ever been to a packed arena and the team's winning and people are cheering, there's an energy there, right? It's because emotion is contagious. And I think Rust, despite his sometimes stoic outward appearance, I think he emanates that empathetic energy to the victims and the witnesses. I mean, the way he goes and talks to that guy, I think it was in this episode, where he talks to that guy on the bayou, on the river there, who, meets him with a shotgun. Yeah, I mean, he shows empathy there. I mean, it's not, the thing about Rust is it's minimalist in its expression. He isn't overflowing with it. He doesn't like clap people on the back like Marty does, and he is not effusive with his expression of it, but it's genuine, and I think people can sense it. And even that guy, he opened up to him. I mean, he answered him with a shotgun, and he ends up talking to him, and I think that's a quality Rust has. So when he goes to this psych ward to talk to, I think Kelly, I think her name was Kelly, but I can't remember for sure. It doesn't surprise me that some girl who's been in a near catatonic state for 7 years turns and talks to him. Might have something to do with the fact that she remembers him from being rescued by him. I don't know. But it is interesting that she chooses to talk to him.
Well, yeah, Russ is, that's a kind of theme throughout this entire episode, is like Russ is pretty convinced, based on the information from the guy that killed himself, that he was going to interview, because he mentions the Yellow King Carcosa, that the case was never solved, that it's still going on, right? So that's why he's interviewing the revival minister. He interviewed the gentleman that you mentioned just recently, and he's going to interview the victim from the psych ward that they saved. So he goes in there and he's asking her about, some of the stuff that went on there with Reggie and those guys. And he mentions the man with the scars, man with the green ears. And he goes, the scars along the bottom is his face. And she just goes into a full on psychotic outbreak at the sheer mention of the man with the scars on his face. And it's horrifying because when I remember watching this when this episode came out, right? So I watched it like a little bit later that day, right? So I was up quite late at night, and it terrified me like something straight out of a horror film, because all I could think of was, what did this girl have to go through that 7 years later she's still basically not a human being in the sense that we would understand.
Still horrified by it.
Yeah. Like she's a human being in the sense that she deserves dignity. She has a soul, yada, yada, yada. But in a lot of ways, she's almost kind of like an abused animal in some ways. I don't know if you've ever been around like abused animals, like just the littlest thing. And then, they're peeing themselves or they're running into a corner or they're crying. And this is basically what's happened to this little girl. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, what did they do to her? Like what type of drugs did they force her to take? Obviously there was sexual abuse that went on there. Was she involved in murders that she wasn't even really aware of because she was high on LSD or whatever? Like, I guess it's LSD. They are giving them, but it's probably an extremely high potency of LSD, and LSD by itself is already pretty potent. That's all.
Meth too.
Meth, God knows what else they're cooking up, right? And that's all I can think of. And, a lot of people push back and say in this scene that Russ shows like no sympathy at all. I mean, he's the only guy that cares, though, enough to actually interview her and try to get to the bottom of this case. What is he supposed to be? Like, people take like issue with the fact that he just kind of gets up and walks away. What is Russ supposed to do in that situation? What is he going to hug her and say like everything's going to be okay? All the doctors are there.
He's letting the professionals do their thing. Like, he respects other people's professional capacity. And he's like, these doctors, these orderlies, these nurses, they know their business. They're going to take care of this far better than I am. The best thing I can do is remove myself from the situation so that at least one source, one catalyst for her reliving this trauma has been removed. And you notice as he walks out too, all the other patients are staring at him as he walks past, like he's the boogeyman, But I agree with you. I think the most caring thing he could do in that situation is exactly what he did do.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors.
But I mean, thus far, because of Rust, I think he's actually working off the clock, right? Because this is not an official case. He finds out that there was, at the very least, something related to like a child, like sex trafficking ring was being covered up at the Tuttle Ministries, or at least wasn't investigated. He talks to this girl, confirms the man with the scars on his face when they were looking for Maria Fontenot, who mentioned something about a man with scars on his face. Okay, well, obviously there's a man with scars on his face, and he's connected to all of this. Nobody else in this town is caring about actually trying to get to the bottom of this. Everyone's just happy. It's like, well, they got their guy in 95, even though there's like all these missing people cases, which we're going to get into in a minute, that is going on around here, and Russ is gathering his evidence. He's showing these spiral symbols. He's showing these stick figures. And, initially, if you're just hearing it, you might think, oh, this is kind of crazy, right? But like very clearly, nobody else seems to care except for him. Marty's perfectly happy just never talking about this again. It's like, oh, I'm the hero cop. I saved those 2 kids. We got our guy, whatever. Like, why are you even worrying about this?
Well,
Russ the only one.
Marty's busy.
Yeah,
that's something else right now.
So it just blows my mind that people accuse Russ of not being empathetic when in actuality, he's the only one that cares about any of these people. He wants to get justice for that little girl.
Yeah, people are looking for people to respond demonstratively. Like, they want to see emotional reactions. They want it to be all on the surface. and they make their judgments based on what's on the surface. And, you know, it takes a little bit of thinking and a little bit of reflection to realize sometimes that just because somebody doesn't show emotion, you know, what do their actions show, you know, and Russ's actions. And like I said, I think his energy probably, shows a great deal of empathy. That was a terrible scene just because like they were heroes for finding these girls. And yet what's the aftermath? I mean, not these kids rather. You know, one of them is already dead and the other one spends 7 years, you know, in a catatonic state and only comes out of it to give him a little bit of information and have a massive psychotic incident. You know, I mean, that's dark. That's disturbing. You know, it's not a happy thing.
Well, and then he also goes and interviews like Billy Lee Tuttle, which is one of the better acted scenes in the show. Well, initially he gets told, hey, cut it out. You're interviewing, I think it was the interview at the psych ward. They ended up calling the precinct and be like, you can't have cops coming down here and doing this type of stuff. They tell his boss tells him, you know, like, cut it out or you're going to get suspended. You know, Russ being Russ, he doesn't care. So he goes and ends up interviewing Billy Lee Tuttle. And that's one of the better acted sequences in the entire show, in my opinion, right? Just the tension between the two of them. And you had already mentioned Billy Lee Tuttle. Like, he's smiling, but you could tell there's nothing there. It's all fake. And Russ sees through it right away. And he knows he's making him uncomfortable. And I don't know what you think of that scene.
Yeah. Yeah. And he does some things that they appear subtle, you know, in the way that he delivers them, but they're very calculated and not subtle at all. I mean, when they're first talking and he tells Russ that this people owe him a great debt, and Russ comes back with, you know, not as much as they owe you. And then he starts to say, oh yes, we're very proud of our ministry and the different charities that we support. And he names one, and then he names, you know, the state police, you know, disability fund or whatever it is. But he basically reminds Rust, hey, we throw money at your organization. Don't forget that, you know, that's the purpose of that. And he makes it seem almost offhandy. You know, I mean, if you're not really listening to what he's saying and with a little bit of intent, then it might slide right past. And then later on, when he says he can look at all of the files that he wants or whatever, you know, he makes sure to point out, of course, we lost some flooding in a sub-basement. I mean, he creates a plausible reason for Russ not finding what he wants, while cloaking it in the appearance of absolute cooperation. So that when he calls Major Salter and complains, he can say, I offered, you know, the detective came here and he said these things. I offered to let him see any and all materials that we might have, even set him up with an archivist, a clerk, to help him. And he didn't take me up on that. Then he left. I'm curious, Major, why was he here? Is this an official investigation that I should be aware of or something? You know, I can hear that conversation. You know, but we don't get to see that, and I'm glad, but we do get to see the Major's reaction after that. So I agree with you. It's a well acted scene, and that Billy Lee Tuttle character, that actor that plays him, is like, I can't think of him as anything other than Billy Lee Tuttle. The way he plays it so well, like, it's just, I want to punch the guy. He's so greasy,
and it's so crazy because he's only in the show you see him a little bit in episode 2, and I don't even think it's episode 1.
I'll bet he's got like 7 minutes of screen time in the entire 8 hours. I'll bet that's about it.
Yeah. You know, and it's why he makes such an impression. That's one thing that the show has done very well. You know, like Reggie Ledoux, probably one of the more iconic crime figure bad guys or detective bad guys. He's on screen for 3 minutes. Billy Lee Tuttle, you just mentioned 7 minutes maybe in total. Even
the Reverend, he's really only on for about 7 or 8 minutes, 10 minutes maybe. I know he's really got maybe 3 scenes, right? The scene at the tent, and the scene helping out Rust when he talks to one of the parishioners, and then the scene in 2002. So it may be a little more than 10 minutes, but probably not. I mean, it's right around there at most. And that's, this show is so well cast. You know, I can't act, you know, I mean, that's not a talent that I have. And And I really admire how an actor can just disappear into a character and you feel like that is who they are, like the way that they portray it. Because it's so easy when, bad acting is so obvious, right? It's laughable and we hate it. It's like bad face animation in a video game or whatever. Like something's off about it. There's an uncanny valley effect there that we're like, oh, that's not right. That's not human. And acting's kind of the same way. If it's poor, you're like, oh my God, I can't, the suspension of disbelief is totally shattered. It's like bad writing, when you're trying to get into a story, it brings you out of the story because it reminds you that you're reading. And so I think good acting is, people take it for granted when they see it, but they shouldn't, because it's a huge talent. And the casting for this show, I mean, I cannot think of a single character. I'd have to think really hard, and I don't know if I'd find one that was like, mediocre acting. Maybe the most mediocre actor that I can think of off the top of my head was the writer Pizzolatto when he played a bartender in that scene where Marty was trying to find Tyson Weems a few episodes ago, and he wasn't bad. He just was a little, he was mediocre. And everybody else was so good. So one of the reasons this is a great series is because the acting is so phenomenal. Yes, the writing, the direction, the storytelling, all of those things. But without the absolutely masterful acting by McConaughey and Harrelson and the extremely good to absolutely excellent support acting, it wouldn't fully realize its own excellence. And as much as you want to wash your hands after that scene with Billy Lee Tuttle, you got to give it up for the actor for making you feel that way.
Yeah, as a side note, I've often thought I'd probably make a pretty good actor because I'm able to keep a straight face really well and kind of inhabit other people's brains pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, I think being able to inhabit someone else's perspective is a talent that I feel like I do have in terms of it translating into being a writer. I think you can write convincing characters if you can put yourself in their shoes and really truly wonder, what would they be thinking? Why are they doing this? That kind of thing. What do they want? How would they react? But I can't translate that into like my own behavior in a way that would be convincing acting. I mean, and so much, I probably play guitar better than I act. That's how poor my acting is. But I admire both actors and musicians, right? Because it's like skating. I mean, I know people are going to be bored hearing all these hockey things because, we're both fans, but like people watch the players and they think, they don't really think about how hard it is what they're doing. Then you strap on skates, much less go play hockey, but just strap on skates. And ice skating's hard. It's a talent. It's a skill that you have to learn, and it takes time and it takes effort and it takes technique to be better than horrible at. And then, hockey's another step squared beyond that. And I think someone who has played recreational hockey has more appreciation for how good, the professional players are than somebody who's never skated. Just like somebody who's picked up a guitar probably realizes how damn hard some of the stuff they see people doing that looks so easy really is. And I think acting's the same way. And it just really comes out in this episode. And, I don't know if it came out in this episode. I think it's on display here with all these supporting, as Rust goes and does his interviews, you get all these supporting roles that just shine.
Well, I guess the other big thing that happens in this episode is Rust and Marty basically just have about as big of a fallout as you possibly can imagine.
Yeah.
So
when you have to Marty go back to the genesis of that, which is Marty needed a new phone.
Yeah. So, yeah, Marty goes into the T-Mobile store, big product placement, and he's carrying around 2 bags. We find out later what's in the bags, and this attractive young lady, Beth, comes up to him and starts, you can almost immediately. This is somewhat where I'm like, I'm like, what is with Marty and these beautiful women wanting to be around him all the time? I mean, Woody Harrelson's like, he's not horrendous looking, but he's not the guy that, like, I get why we talked about on the first episode why they wanted Matthew McConaughey to play the role of Marty, because some of these interactions would make a little bit more sense.
In other words, you're saying, how the heck would a guy who looks like Woody pull such gorgeous women, is what you're saying.
So she comes up and immediately starts like kind of hitting on him. I don't even think Marty realizes that she's doing it at first. And, he's walking out of the store and he sees the bar and he looks at his bag and he's carrying around, like, I think it's a bunch of boxes of tampons for all the women back home in his life. And he just feels so demasculated in that situation. He goes, screw it. I'm going to the bar. And she ends up following him to the bar and starts hitting on him there. And one of the funny things I thought in that whole entire sequence is, wouldn't you have just dropped the bags off in your car and then gone to the bar?
Yeah, he's standing right there. Yeah.
carries the bags of with boxes of tampons with him, and she sees it and just kind of has a chuckle, which would mean, like, at the very least, she must know that he's he's probably married, if he's
he's wearing a wedding ring too. But Marty basically falls off both wagons in one episode. I mean, he's in there drinking, and I don't know, maybe he's drinking in moderation anyway, but it feels like a different kind of drinking or falling off the wagon. And then of course, when Beth comes in, it, very quickly becomes something more than that. It's interesting. She's wearing a T-Mobile shirt when she's at work and when she comes into the bar, but the next time it cuts away to Russ doing some of his investigation. And when it cuts back to them, they obviously left that bar and went somewhere else and met somewhere else or something, because she's changed into a dress and they're standing, and it's nighttime now too. So, I don't know how Marty gets away with this. I mean, I don't understand. I guess he must have a pretty flexible, weird schedule that doesn't raise, Maggie's eyebrows, because I have no desire to have an affair, but I think about how much communication I have with my wife and, just texts that we exchange and share what we're doing and things like that. And I can't imagine how someone, would go about, getting away with that, in that kind of a situation. And for Marty, he's on probation. He's on probation for the rest of his life, just seems like he has the run of the place, I guess, obviously he must lie to her a lot about what he's up to, and she is not entirely fooled by that, but she doesn't have the smoking gun until a little bit later in the episode, when she quite literally sees who he's fooling around. Because, spoiler alert, they go back to her place.
Yeah, so Marty ends up sleeping with Beth. You can tell that he feels like immediate kind of regret. I mean, the whole thing is kind of gross right from the get-go, because, like, I understand, like, she's like a super attractive woman, but Marty's like older, and this is like the girl that he met at the bunny ranch and gave money to.
Mm-hmm. She was underage at the time.
This type of stuff. Like, he must have. There's no way that he didn't remember Russ telling him, like, is that a down payment? I don't know. Maybe he's like forgotten completely, but I know I would have remembered that, and I would have been like, no. Now, it would have been like one thing if he started, like, this would have been my reaction. I'd be like, I'm happy that you're doing very well for yourself, and maybe in some aspects you could like help her do better in her life. Like, he works at a police station. I'm sure he knows some nice police officers that are in and around her age, and be like, like, why don't you guys, I know this girl, I saved her, whatever, try to hook her up with like a nice guy or something, right? Like, I can, like, that would be somewhat reasonable. I mean, that would be understandable. To sleep with her, though, is so gross. And I think he feels how gross it is.
Yeah, I think he does before it happens. He struggles with it but she gives him almost gives him an out. Like, she says to him, these weaknesses that we have are not weaknesses. They are, it's how God made us, and it's not a mistake. And she basically is speaking very thinly veiled code here, that, hey, whatever we're about to do, it's okay. And then, do you want some bourbon? is about as subtle as do you want to, I keep being careful because it's a PG-13 podcast here, but do you want to hump? I guess I'll say that. I'll channel my Last Kingdom terminology here. But he struggles with it. You can see it on his face. I mean, Harrelson, and because McConaughey did such an outstanding job with Rust, and because Rust is the more fascinating and less mainstream character, I think sometimes Harrelson's performance gets overlooked slightly, and he's has so many moments where he emotes so well, and he speaks volumes without saying a word, and in this sequence where you can see him struggling with what Beth is doing, and then he succumbs to it, and then immediately after they're finished, like she is putting her head on his chest, in the middle of post-coital bliss, and his expression is already shifted to, guilt and self-loathing. And so, I mean, I think Marty has grown, but only incrementally, only enough. Like, he didn't really feel bad about it before. He made excuses for it. It's taken the edge off. It's good for the family. That's why I'm seeing Alexandra Daddario, the Lisa character. Now, 7 years later, the entirety of his growth is that he can feel bad about what he's about to do and what he just did. Not great, not a lot, but at least something. I'll give him a D- for showing up and doing the work, even if he did a horrible job. He knows what the repercussions are going to be here, and he does it anyway. So it is gross. I agree with you. It's gross.
Marty apparently still doesn't really understand how a cell phone works. I don't know if you guys remember, I believe it was episode 5 where Rust is showing him it's episode 4 actually. He's showing him how to use the cell phone when they're doing the Iron Crusaders shtick.
That was 95, and I remember 94, 95. I was a young patrol officer, and I bought a cell phone, and you might maybe got some free minutes, but not many, and you were paying 25 cents a minute to use your cell phone, and it had to be plugged in to. The battery sucked, and so you'd plug it into your lighter and so forth. But I mean, I think that was believable that Rust would have to double check that he knows what to do with the phone or whatever. But by 2002 with his flip phone, I mean, I had that flip phone. It wasn't exactly, it wasn't exactly there weren't many features, and they were all easy to understand. So why he wasn't deleting texts. I mean, given that he knows his own past and it's just dumb. It's almost like he wanted to be caught. I don't think he did, but maybe subconsciously he did. Maybe who knows? I can't examine it. It's the evidence is too thin, but, clearly he needs some cell phone message, tutelage from Mustache Chris, because, he totally banged it up here.
Well, that he comes right home, doesn't say anything, throws his clothes right in the wash. Like, it's just like odd behavior right from the get-go, which is going to, obviously, considering what has happened previously in a relationship, anybody with like a bit of sense is going to be like, oh, there's something going on here. And, she flips through the phones and she sees like the phone call logs and the pictures, and
from like 4:39 in the morning, which unless you're a shift worker, nothing good is happening in those hours.
So she comes to the conclusion, obviously, that Marty's cheating on her, and she's going to go out and get revenge. But before we get to her revenge, Russ ends up getting suspended because of his interview with Billy Lee Tuttle. And Marty doesn't know what's going on. In his defense, he literally has no idea what's going on. At this point, Russ is not telling Marty anything.
No, he's flying solo. I mean, they had that scene where he dumped the paperwork on Marty, and they had some conflict in the hallway there. So they're not doing so well, and Rust isn't sharing anything with him. To his credit, though, Marty sticks up for him in that scene.
Yeah, they suspend him for 30 days without pay, and then he's also got to do another 30 days of, he's got to do.
He has to do a certain number of hours of therapy. I don't know if it was 30 or not, or whatever it was. But what's Rust's response to that, though?
It's oh, you gotta revive him. I gotta right off the top of my head. What does he say again?
I am the least in need of counseling of anyone in this state, basically. That's what he says.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, now it's coming crystal in my head. But he's not wrong. Like, they're suspending him for uncovering something that's clearly going on. Like, as he mentions it, it's like, I can't decide whether this is like a massive cover-up or you guys are just all idiots. He says garden variety incompetence. But at that point, it really could be either one.
Sure.
Like, the cops are all in on this like massive cover-up. I'm not saying like the guy trolling the thing. And I don't even think really that they'd be aware that they're part of the cover-up. Like, the chief of police is like, well, Billy Lee Tuttle is the cousin of the state senator. You can't be, you know what I mean? Like, so like just by proxy, he's kind of covering it up, right? Like, that's the nature of some conspiracies, in the sense a lot of the people that might be involved, even higher up, they don't even necessarily know what they're doing. But he also is thinking like, this could be, they're just all idiots, which is a very real possibility. A lot of times people see conspiracy and on the surface, it might look like conspiracy, but then also people don't take into account just how stupid people are. I know that sounds harsh, but it's the truth. There's a lot of dumb people that probably shouldn't be in positions that they're in, but because of politics and they know like how to talk to people and yada, 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 they do. And it could be just incompetence.
Yeah, I think incompetence, but I wouldn't sell short the idea of a lack of communication and a desire to stay in your lane because there's plenty of work for you to do there. You kind of put those two things together. I mean, from a communication standpoint, if different organizations, not just police organizations, but public welfare type of organizations too, social and public outreach and, other things, they're all operating in a silo and they're only communicating from one silo to another when absolutely necessary. And they're not going outside their own silo looking for more work to do because their silo is pretty full. And so is that a form of incompetence? It certainly is, but it's not born of people being dumb or stupid. It's born of them being either focused on their own work or simply overwhelmed and trying to eat all the chocolates coming down their conveyor belt and not go into somebody else's factory looking for more chocolates, to refer to the Lucille Ball skit. It's a pretty famous comedy skit. But, either way, the other thing about what Rust is doing here is, he's working an unassigned case. And that's not a big deal to viewers and readers. They think that cops do that all the time. And the answer is no, they don't. For one reason, that there's so much work for you already that's assigned. I'm not saying it never happens. I mean, when I was a detective, and I was only a detective for a couple of years before I was promoted to sergeant. Not my plan, but it worked out that way. I kept some back burner cases. There were cases that I didn't suspend because I thought that something might happen with them, and I put them at the back of the rack and I hung on to them. And I would sometimes work them even though they weren't in my kind of active rotation or weren't the hottest thing I just got assigned or whatever. But that's about as far as most guys go. They keep a case active that maybe they could also get rid of because it's been, all leads exhausted essentially. Rust is going a step further than that. Like he's out actively creating cases, and he's got, to the major's credit, he's right. He's got no physical evidence. He's got a lot of conjecture. The fact that he's probably right, Rust, isn't, Salter doesn't know that. The major doesn't know that. And he flat out told him to stop doing this investigation, and Rust didn't. That's rank insubordination, and the misuse of department resources is Rust's time is being misused because he's been ordered not to do that. So honestly, I mean, if as a viewer, I'm like, oh man, Rust got done dirty, but looking at it as someone who's been Salter, basically, been the commander of the entire investigative unit, or division, he deserved to be suspended. Whether he deserved 30 days or not, I might be on Marty's side there. but he deserved to be suspended or supported. And let's figure this out once and for all. But the fact is the major was getting, outside pressures as well that kept him from wanting to go that route.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
Well, so Russ gets suspended, and we cut to a scene where he's in his apartment and he's drinking, and we've already seen before Russ drinking is not a good idea. And we see he's got like Carcosa and Yellow King stuff like all up in his apartment. Now, I don't know if I got do you think he's had that all in his apartment for a couple of years now, or he put it up as soon as he got suspended?
I think he started putting it up. I think it was a process, much like his storage locker in the next episode, that started after he talked to the guy with the really bad pockmark scarring that said Yellow King to him. I think he started out just one step at a time, adding this, adding that. And by the time, I get the feeling that he's been investigating for at least a few weeks, if not longer, after that incident. So it's had time to build up, and clearly he's obsessing. And now that he's not on the job, he can drink more without it worrying about, I don't think he worries about the drinking keeping him from thinking clearly necessarily, but I do think he kept his drinking on duty. I don't think he drank on duty because he knew that would inhibit his ability to do his job in his interactions with other people. Once he's off the job, it's, that's no longer an issue.
Yeah. And then we see Maggie, she puts on her little red dress and she's going to go head out to a bar and cheat on Marty. She's finally going to get revenge. And almost immediately one guy starts hitting on her at the bar because, she looks stunning.
Wouldn't you? Yeah. Wouldn't you? If you're single?
And, it cuts and you think, oh, is she going to go sleep with that random guy? But then it cuts to her showing up at Rust's apartment in a different dress, but also equally attractive with a bottle of wine, drunk. And she sees that Rust has been drinking too. And she starts saying, well, did you know that Marty was doing it again? Yada, yada, yada. And she seduces him and they have sex, is the lack of a better word, but it's not even really that. I don't even know how to describe it. There's nothing
short and brutal.
Romantic. Yeah, short and brutal, right? There's nothing really romantic about it at all, right? And
it wasn't supposed to be. I think she came over there without a doubt with the intention of doing exactly that.
Well, and immediately after, Russ realizes kind of what happened in his drunk stupor, and she starts like, oh, I'm sorry, but I had to get back at Marty, and yet she's trying to explain herself to what just happened, and Russ, almost on the verge of giving her smack, screams her out of the apartment, and she gets the point. One of the more bizarre, the thing that made it so unnerving for me, and I don't know if a lot of people pointed this out, Russ has pictures of dead people all up on his walls, and he's hammered, and the apartment's not well lit. And this is, right in the middle of there. That's where they're going to have it. I don't know. It's so can you imagine? You were a detective, right? So you must have seen you must have had crazy pictures. And you imagine having that spewed all over the bedroom, and it's oh, I'm gonna have some alone time with the wife. It's, you know what I mean? It's bizarre, right?
Yeah. Well, she planned it, and that's where he was, and she needed this to happen. And I don't think she was interested in where or exactly how, just that it did. And she knew that Russ wouldn't lie about it because that wasn't his nature. So she knew Marty would find out, or when she told him that he would confirm it or believe it. Part of the reason it's believable, even without any evidence, if somebody just told you it happened, well, her telling it makes it pretty believable, right? Was obvious affection between the two, maybe even attraction. And I think they have an exchange along those lines in the final episode, that this wouldn't have happened if Rust didn't have some feelings for her, and he was lonely and he was drunk and he was all kind of at a low point. And here's this, and she comes on hard. She doesn't just drop a few hints, you said seduces him. That's a fair statement. So the fact that it happened there in the kitchen with all these pieces of his obsession surrounding them, I think is actually kind of a cool touch, and a little symbolic maybe. But compare that to the sex scene earlier, between Marty and Beth, which was fairly garden variety HBO sex scene, right? And minus, like I said before, Marty's reaction afterwards, that really tells you a lot. But this was very different, and the lighting and the manner in which they went about it and everything was, like I said, short and brutal. I thought it was interesting when she said something to him like, "You can't live like this," or something like that, and Russ says something like, "I've learned people giving advice are usually talking to themselves," or something like that. She just blasts right past that. She is a woman on a mission, and mission accomplished.
Yeah, I've heard some pretty crazy interpretations of this whole scene where people were like, Maggie's, I don't know, she's asserting her sexual power and becoming a powerful woman. She's taking control of her life. She's getting back at Marty. And I guess that's more of like a feminist look at...
I don't know. I mean, she is getting back at Marty, right? I mean, but more than that, she's taking control of her life. She knows Marty will not come back from this. This is her checkmate move. If she went and banged that guy in the bar with her red dress on, that whole scene, Marty might find a way to forgive her. Like, I cheated on you. Not right away, maybe, but maybe a year later he wants to reconcile or something. No way does he come back from this, especially not after the lawnmower scene.
Yeah, but like...
Russ mowed Marty's lawn. That's what happened here.
But to me, the way I kind of interpret it is she accuses Marty of being a coward. To me, she's being a coward. She's taking advantage of Russ in a vulnerable state. A man, I might add, that she confided into for many years, right? And they've had deep personal conversations between each other. If you read between the lines, and also the conversations that are on screen. If something's going wrong in her life, who does she call most of the time? Initially, she's not even calling Marty. She's calling Russ, asking for advice of what to do. Mm-hmm. This is the guy she decides to pretty much use. I know Russ is willing and he did it himself, but to get back at Marty, she couldn't have picked anybody else. She picked Russ.
Yeah, I think that's the point though, Chris. I mean, I think, she went through this when Lisa showed up and blew up their lives. And then she reconciled with Marty, and she tells Russ after, while he's basically, like you put it, yelling her out of the apartment, that her purpose in choosing him was he could never accept this. He'll never come back from this. She knew this was the only checkmate move she had. This was the only kill shot that she had for the marriage, because Marty would most likely come back from if she, slept with some rando. So I think that her purpose was clear and her purpose was logical, and she accomplished exactly what she set out for. Now, to your point, though, is it a jerk move? I mean, there are other things I could call it if we were a rated R podcast, but out of respect for Steve Guerra, I'll keep it clean. It's a jerk move. You bet it is. She's a, as we used to say on the job, she's an Adam Henry for doing this, right? But you understand why and what she's going through, and Rust has some complicity. Yeah, he was vulnerable, but he could have found a way to disengage himself if he wasn't struggling with what he was struggling with. So I think both of them are complicit, and yet I can find some forgiveness for both of them too, based on what they're going through. I mean, if you think about it, I'm not excusing either one of them, but none of this would have happened if Marty would have just told Beth, "Thanks for the offer, but I've got bourbon at home." But that's, Marty's failure. And so I think people are overly harsh on Maggie here and on Rust. I don't think they deserve to get off the hook, but I don't think they're giant POSs, that should just be, left at the curb with trash bags and so forth. I get why this happened, even if I think it's kind of despicable on both counts. It's understandable.
Maggie tells Marty that she slept with somebody and that it's somebody that he knew. And Marty at first doesn't know what to think, right? Oh, it's just she slept with somebody. He's like, almost
what are you telling me right now, I think is what he says.
You know what I mean? He's like, I get it. I deserve
denial.
It.
Denial.
I could see it on his face where he's just like, I kind of deserve this. And then she says it was Rust. And then his face turns and he's about to they both stand up, and he's almost practically got his arm. No, he's going to start choking her, right? Because he's just so angry. And she says, yeah, well, you're going to ruin your relationship with your daughters. And she's not wrong. That would probably be the final nail in the coffin. Daddy beating up mommy, and he knows she knows that's pretty much the only thing that he really cares about is his daughters, even though he has a weird roundabout way of showing it. Yeah, and that's it. That's like you said, that's the kill shot. That's the final nail in the coffin. And the way she delivers, the performance in that scene is, you can tell it's so cold, but you can tell that she's loving every second of it. And she's like, I'm finally getting back at you.
Yeah, I don't even think it's I'm getting back at you. I think it's more I'm finally going to be free of this without a guilty conscience. But yeah, I don't know. All I know is it speeds up near the end of this episode with the Rust and Maggie encounter, and then you get I think it's right after that or right before that you get Marty taking a call from Beth, where she basically is begging him to come over and essentially seduces him again with words over the phone, by appealing to his lust. And then you get him coming home and getting told what he's told. And I think it's like the very next scene that he's at work and here's Rust has shown up. And so what a great, he stands up and heads out, and then he's self-aware enough to know he needs to make this an unofficial thing. So he takes off his badge and his gun and everything. And of course takes his tie and jacket off and all that. But he's also, I think, like protecting himself against himself. Like if he has his gun, he might just use it, sort of thing. And he goes barreling out there and they get in a fight.
Russ tells him, like, I'm here, Marty, I'm just picking up my files. Like he clearly, I don't know why. I think Russ did this on purpose to just get it out of the way, because I assume somebody could have just brought the files for him.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think he's like spoonful of medicine. Better just swallow it now.
And Russ comes out and probably has. I think the director must have been a big fan of the movie They Live, because this fight scene kind of reminds me a little bit of
it's very
fight
realistic.
Scene. What?
It's a very realistic fight scene. I mean, it's not.
Well, that's what it is. Like it's raw, it's realistic, and it goes on for quite some time.
It feels like it does, but when I watched it a second time, Chris, it's actually like a 20-second fight, or 30 seconds at the most. Yeah, go back and watch it again and time it. It's from the time Marty charges at him to the point at which they're in a clinch and you see Rust get a wrist lock on Marty and then they get pulled apart. It's under 30 seconds. It's under 30 seconds, which is still a long time on a TV show, but like that They Live, that was like what, a 4-minute fight scene or something.
So it reminded me a lot of.
Oh yeah. Yeah. The visceral nature of it.
Well, and also like Russ telling Marty, like, stay down, stay like, I think that's literally like there's a couple of lines in They Live in the fight scenes where it's just like, stay down. And
I think Rust took his medicine in more ways than one here. I think he let Marty get a couple of shots in, and then he used, I think he has some background in martial arts. I think he maybe jujitsu or aikido or some kind of a turn the force of the attacker against themselves sort of style, because the way he sidesteps and throws, shoves Marty to the ground and stuff, and his use of joint lock techniques and so forth is reminiscent of that sort of style. But I think he takes a couple of shots to maybe like let Marty get his, I think he feels guilty for what he did, and he takes a couple of shots, and then he's like, all right, now we're gonna end this, and and then when he puts him down, just stay down. And of course Marty's not going to listen. But yeah, I think it's one of the better fight scenes in terms of realism in any TV show I've ever seen, really. I mean, it's top 5 ever.
Yeah, so then it cuts to the police captain comes out and drags them both into the office, screaming at all the other officers that are just watching this go on, because
yeah, that was classic.
Watch. Like, why wouldn't you watch just to see what would happen, right? And
and I think a lot of people in the office don't like Rust. That was made apparent throughout the years, and like for a while in 95, they hated him, and then he busts open this big case. And so that softens a little bit. You can even see in that scene back when in that episode where they go into the police station and the guy takes out the booze and everybody's, cheering and Rust kind of points at Marty and is already trying to deflect, like, Marty can be our ambassador of good cheer and I can just go about my business sort of gesture. And one of the guys that was hard on Rust at one point, offers his hand to him in a very conciliatory fashion. So I think he probably rode that for a while, and then his reputation of being able to get confessions didn't hurt. But I still think people like harbored some resentment towards him. And so when they see Marty's going to jump in and try to kick his ass, I think there are plenty of people who wanted to see that happen.
Yeah. So, they go into the office and the captain's obviously flabbergasted. He's like, he had just suspended Russ. Marty looks like crap. Like, Marty's been looking like crap coming into the office. He's like, you could tell that, like, I'm just so done with these guys. And he starts like grilling them, like, what is going on here? You guys are fighting each other in front of the office. He's like, is anyone pressing charges? Nobody answers. And
no, actually, I think Marty asked that question, like, the major's peppering him with what's going on with you. And he's like, it's just something personal. And he's like, no, out with it. And Marty's like, is anyone pressing charges? Of course, Rust is like, not me.
Yeah, then Rust just stands up and says probably one of my favorite lines that he says in the entire show. He says, bleep it, I quit. And he just walks out of the office and says, "Nice hook, Marty." It's just
that's the line I like, is when he's leaving and he's like, and just very laconic, dry, "Nice hook, Marty."
It's just such a Rust thing. And it's something I can really relate to, where, like, when I was younger, I've quit jobs like this, not like fighting in front of wherever I was working with another guy, but where when I was in my early, 19, 18, 20s or whatever, like I walked out of a job like that, whereas, screw this, I quit and just walked out and I just never talked to anybody ever again. And it's such a fitting way for Russ to quit. Of course he's going to quit like this. He can't quit like a normal person.
Yeah. And then, and then we get the end of Marty's interview with Papania and Gilbo, where he basically tells them, I don't know who Rust is or what he's become, but don't call me because I won't help you. So he's still loyal to Rust, even though, right? And gets up and leaves. And that's when Rust shows up honking his horn and pulls him over, and we get Marty maybe not sure by checking his gun. I thought it was great editing from the point of going from Marty's account to Maggie's account to seeing it firsthand, and how they wove all that together and they get up to the fight and you see the taillight get broken and when he throws Marty into it. And then what a great ending. Like, Rust gets in his truck and you see it from that side of the truck viewpoint, but you can see the broken taillight still 10 years later. As he pulls away, and then it cuts to black after a while. Just again, some stellar ending or editing rather by this. And I don't know who edited. I wonder how much input the writer or director had on the editing. I imagine a fair amount, but I have a buddy who edits for television, and it's not always as collaborative as I thought it was. A lot of times he cuts the whole thing together and then they give him notes and he recuts what he needs to recut. I always thought of, a scene of the director and or the writer sitting in with the editor while they discuss things, but I guess it doesn't always happen that way.
Yeah, there's that infamous example, I think, where the director of American History X disowned his movie because Edward Norton didn't like his edit, and apparently he went in there with an editor and they re-edited the entire film, and virtually to the point where it wasn't even the same movie anymore. And I mean, the rest is history. I guess it kind of made Edward Norton's career. So
I thought it was a good movie.
Job on it.
Yeah.
But
yeah, so that's episode 6. And I think it's the meatier episode in a lot of ways. I mean, it brings us up to the present, and now all we have left is the sprint to the end is kind of the way the pacing goes. We've wrapped everything up from the past, and now we're gonna live in the future. You want to give the listeners the rundown for episode 7 so they kind of, I know everybody's probably seen it, but this way they can remember what exactly happened specifically in this episode.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
So I got to give you guys a quick plot overview of episode 7. I to be honest with you, I think episode 7 is my favorite episode. I was reading in reviews when it came out, and a lot of people had issues with this episode because it was so plot driven, and it was about the conspiracy, and I don't understand what people's issue is, because that's exactly how this show has functioned to a degree. It's like you have like the character driven episode, and then the episode almost immediately after kind of drives the plot a little bit forward, and then it's back to the character driven episode. So that's kind of how it's always kind of functioned.
But one of the things that might have subconsciously bugged people or just like shook them a little bit or whatever is this is the first, episode 7 and episode 8 are all current events. There's no interviews taking place. There's no flashbacks. There's no voiceover, like we got. And so stylistically, there's a pretty big shift in the storytelling in that regard, not necessarily so, and I think correctly, but it's a little jarring maybe on a subconscious level because you're used to a certain type of storytelling for 6 episodes, and now bang, these last 2 are much more like a normal television show, which is told, chronologically and without flashbacks and no voiceover and so forth. So that might be one reason some people didn't dig it as much. I mean, I'm not saying it's my favorite episode. I really liked it, though.
So, yeah, okay. So, in 2012, Russ presents Marty with evidence of the cult he believes is responsible for the disappearance of women and children along the coast in Louisiana. Among the evidence is a videotape which Russ stole from Reverend Billy Lee Tuttle's home of men in costumes and masks ritualistically graping and ritualistically doing bad things and murdering Maria Fontenot, the missing girl case they'd briefly investigated in 95. Russ denies killing Tuttle, speculating that others did to prevent Tuttle from being blackmailed over the tape. Marty, shaken from watching the videotape, agrees to join the investigation. They learn that Tuttle had an illegitimate half-brother with the surname Childress, whose son had scars on his face. They also learn that the former colleague Steve Gracia, is that how?
I thought it was like Garaki or something like that, or Garricky, maybe Garricky. I'd have to go back and listen. It's funny, that actor is, talk about typecast. He always plays the jerk or goofus cop. Like he's a detective very similar to this role in NYPD Blue, if I remember right. And he does a tremendous job of playing the role. I mean, you don't like him. I'm sure he's a wonderful person in real life, but he's talking about being typecast.
Well, he looks the part, though. That's the thing. Like, he just looks like that type of cop. It's like, I don't really want to go to this guy to solve the crime type thing. Do you know what I mean? Like, he just has that look on him.
Yeah, which I'm sure he cultivates to get the roles, and he plays them to perfection. And maybe he's done other stuff too. I mean, I haven't followed his career closely enough, but it's just other things that I've seen him in. He's been very similarly cast, and he plays this role perfectly.
Marty and Russ kidnap him and gross details from him, threatening that if he should go to the authorities, that he will be taken care of. And it ends with Gilbo and Papania asking the same groundskeeper that Russ encountered at the Light of Way Academy in 95 for directions to the burnt-out church. They drive off without noticing the lower part of his face is heavily scarred, which goes to show you that Russ is not entirely wrong, that Papania and Gilbo are probably not the greatest detectives on the face of the earth, because it's very predominant, the scarring on his face. And that's episode 7. What are, any quick thoughts on episode 7 you want to share, Frank? Or?
Well, I think they managed to keep up the tension that, Rust might be the killer for a little while. I mean, there's the scene in the bar with Marty, which I want to talk about, but we'll come back to it. And then he goes to the storage locker, and, Rust steps into the dark, really. And it's really not until Rust turns on the light and says, what are you packing? Making it clear that he knows, that Marty's suspicious and he's got his gun and he's, Rust doesn't miss much. That's for sure. It's only at that point though, that as a viewer, I think you start to go, I'm not so sure about this Rust thing if I ever was on board. And then boom, he puts Marty through the paces and we very quickly get to a point where as a viewer, much like Marty, who's really kind of throughout this early portion of the episode, he's kind of our stand-in, right? The viewer's stand-in for discovering all this. He's convinced. I mean, he no longer thinks Rust could be or is the killer. He's convinced about the conspiracy. And as a result, so are we as the viewer. And so the whole Rust might have done it thing, which kind of started at the end of episode 5 and was really pushed hard in episode 6. It goes up in smoke here. I mean, I can't imagine anybody 10 minutes into this episode still thought Rust could have been the killer.
Well, let's start with that. You mentioned the scene at the bar. Let's start with that because I believe it's basically where the episode opens up is Russ and Marty sharing that beer that they said they were going to have together. Just talking.
Marty bought the beer, I think, of it. That's how it had to. That's at least Rust said he should. Yeah, I mean, they have a conversation, and Rust says what he says, and he sounds a little bit crazy. And Marty says, "You sound and look a little bit crazy." And why in the HE double hockey sticks would I ever help you? And it's interesting because Rust says you have a duty. And I think that's interesting because, I mean, anybody who looks at this would say casually anyway, or from a civilian standpoint might say, my God, they did their duty. I mean, look what they did in 95. Look what Rust tried to do in 2002. He went above and beyond. I mean, duty. I think they've more than fulfilled their duty, but they left something undone and they both feel responsible for it. And that's one of the things about good cops, of which in my experience, almost all of the men and women I worked with had this trait. And that is that they do feel that they have a higher duty to serve and that they take on responsibility when they work a case or go to a call. Once they're involved, it becomes their responsibility. Like it may not be before that, but it is once they are involved. And of course, this is an extreme example of that. But it's an interesting take on duty because I think most people will be like, Russ did way more than enough. Even Marty did way more than enough. Why do they still feel like they have a duty here? But but they, like any really good cop, feels that sense of duty. And frankly, I think they, especially Marty, he got a little bit of a career boost out of what happened. And I think it might feel a little bit false when he knows that there's a killer still out there, that they didn't do everything that they were proclaimed to have done and then benefited from. And so that creates another sense of duty there. And there's probably other angles you could come up with pretty easily. So I think they certainly do have a duty in their own minds, at least. And then I think it's interesting because they cut away to him going to talk to Maggie. And then, she says, I think they cut away when they're in the storage locker, but before he's completely convinced, because after they talk for a little while, him and Maggie, she says, and so that's it. You're just back together again after all of this time. And what does Marty say? I took some convincing. And then they show the scene where he, tells him about breaking in to Tuttle's house and stealing the videotape and makes him watch the videotape, which is, obviously pretty horrific, but of which we only see a little bit. Most of how horrible it is, we garner from, once again, an absolutely stellar reaction by Woody Harrelson.
Well, I think the moment that it really hits home with Marty in terms of Russ talking to him about the debt that he has to pay is he points out that they maybe could have got this whole case if they had taken in Reggie Ledoux, but Marty made a choice and decided to kill him. Maybe Reggie would have talked.
Yeah, and that's the first time that Russ ever says anything negative about that action. Like that was 20, almost 20 years ago, right? 17 years ago, something like that. And he's never said a negative word about it, I don't think. And now he points out, yeah, if you wouldn't have capped him in the head, we might have maybe got to the bottom of this in 95. Not for nothing.
I think part of it was, I think he knew that there was a bigger case going on here. And I think over the last 10 years or so of, investigating more, he started realizing just how big of a cover up this was, or how big of a conspiracy it was. And it really hit home to him. It's like, we had it right there. Reggie and his cousin, they probably would have talked. We could have got them to talk.
One of them might have talked, yeah.
Screwed that all up, really. And so I think his opinion, I don't think his opinion at the time was, I think he did truly believe what he said. I think it's just changed over time when he started realizing the scale of this conspiracy.
Yeah, I don't think he feels like Marty made a mistake in any shape or form, except that he shut down a potential line of information. That's the only regret I think Rust has about how that turned out. He has no sympathy for Ledoux as a person, or for DeWall as a person. It's interesting what the writer chose to do here, because it's clear that Rust has done a ton of investigating, at least over the last 2 years. If he really did go up to Alaska, like he says, which I think he did, but, the last 2 years, he talks about a lot of the stuff that he did, and it's clear that he did even more than that. And it really serves as a shortcut, almost a cheat code in a way for the plotting. It accelerates it, moves it along, because we don't have to see that process that Rust went through. We just get a couple of little flashbacks while he's talking of him burglarizing Tuttle's place or whatever, and him explaining what he did and so forth. But in the space of, one scene, I mean, it's broken up by the Maggie scene, but we can call it one scene, in the storage locker, we get a summary of what was 2 years of constant investigation by Rust. Really propels the story forward. It would have taken a whole episode to show all that stuff, and they just compress it down into a little exposition, and we don't really notice that that's what's happening, because they break it up with his trip to Maggie, and then he shows him the videotape, and all of that is, serves to keep it from being an obvious info dump, which is what it is, really. It also serves, I guess, to remind the viewer of the salient details that they need to know as we move into this in the final episode. So there's no confusion, which when you're writing a sprawling story like this, because this is an 8-hour movie, right? This is a, 150,000 word novel or whatever. It's a lot of story. This is a chance to distill it down again for those casual or less than deep dive sort of viewers that might not have everything mapped out in their head. Now we'll do that for you, so that you understand what's happening when we see the guy at the end of the episode, or when this happens or that happens. It's all in context.
Yeah, well, Russ is trying to explain to him what he's been doing for the last couple of years at the bar, and Russ comes to the conclusion, he's like, you know what, there's no way around it, and as you pointed out, I have to show you. And honestly, this is probably one of my favorite shots in the movie, is it cuts in the movie, the TV show, I guess. You just called it an 8-hour movie, but I guess
might as well be, right?
Interchangeably, right? And Russ lifts up the door to the storage unit where he's been keeping all this information, and Marty's not quite sure at this point what to do. So he pulls out his gun. He's still a little, rightfully so, a little weirded out by Rust, right? Like, he literally describes his eyes as looking brittle. He doesn't look healthy. He looks insane. And it gets the shot of Rust just standing in the storage unit, and with all the papers all over the walls, and then the words Yellow King, Scars, Carcosa, and he's just standing there. And I thought it was just brilliant the way they did it. Like, you called it an info dump, but this is probably one of the best info dumps I've ever seen.
Absolutely. Masterful. It's masterful. I just wanted to point out that they basically said, okay, the investigation took place at a certain pace throughout the rest of the first 6 episodes. And the stuff that he shares with Marty would have taken a whole episode to show. So they tell it, but they tell it in a masterful fashion. When he goes in there, and then again, breaking it up by having him talk to Maggie, I think it's just very well done. And then the horror of the videotape, and Matthew McConaughey is challenged by, Rust is challenged by Marty when he kind of says, I see a lot of conjecture, and I get the feeling that maybe this is something you've been telling yourself so long that now you believe it. And then Rust has a great comeback to that, right?
Well, and Marty says, I think you pointed out, Marty says, like, oh yeah, I think you've said this to yourself enough times and then drank yourself into believing it.
Yeah.
And Russ goes, there was a time that I did think that this could have been all in my head, but that time has passed. And the way Matthew McConaughey delivers that line, it's scary, but at the same time, it's so heart-wrenching, because you could tell because of this investigation and the fact that nobody believed him, not even his best friend, Marty didn't believe him, pretty much gave up on him, is one of the reasons that he started drinking again. And you can tell that it's been eating away at him, the fact that he knows the truth, yet no one this entire time has been listening to him. And like, I can somewhat, obviously less so than say in Russ's case.
Well, clearly they're going for a much larger conspiracy, and that is so entrenched and has webbing that or roots that have grown out so far or whatever into so many places in society. And that's why Rust sounds crazy. But then if you look at it from his perspective, if he's right, his paranoia is merited and it's correct. And there's a lot of coincidences that happen that, if you have Rust's viewpoint, are going to serve as validation and confirmation. I mean, even Billy Lee Tuttle's death is, could just be an accident, could be natural, could have been that he was murdered or told to kill himself by more powerful people, because now this tape is in somebody else's hands and that was his fault. That's the thing about conspiracies. When you are a believer in a conspiracy, a lot of events serve to fuel that belief that wouldn't serve to convince someone who isn't already convinced, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Right. And that's why Marty pushes back at him. It's like, oh, it sounds like conjecture. Right. But then Russ lays the bomb on him. He goes, I went to Billy Lee. Yeah, I went to Billy Lee Tuttle's house. And Marty's like, if you did something, I don't want to hear it initially. Right. He's like, no, I broke into his house and I broke into the safe. And it's interesting that he points out, isn't it interesting that he never reported the break-in at the Baton Rouge home? And then he shows him the tape because it's irrefutable. He goes, at first he shows him pictures, right, that he stole from another house. And then he shows him the tape. He goes, that's Maria Fontenot. Which is just a wonderful callback to episode 1. And that was the little girl that was apparently went off with her daddy, or that they said went off with her daddy, and then they never decided to investigate it anymore. And Marty's reaction, we get a little bit of what's going on there. Like, we can kind of guess what happens in that tape to a degree, but then it cuts away and all you see is Marty's reaction. He starts screaming uncontrollably. And Marty's a tough guy for something he's like seen that. A lot, right? Yeah. And to get a reaction like that out of him, and he gets up and he just starts hammering the desk, screaming curse words. And at that point, there's no turning back. Well, and he's convinced, and so are we as the viewer. That was my point from earlier. Is now we know that Rust is right. He might not be right about how wide or how deep the conspiracy goes, but there's something there. And then you start to remember things like the guy who mentioned the Yellow King who killed himself in the jail cell. One of the two guards were attending to him was named Childress. Yeah. And one of the guards says something to him. Second guard, one walks away, the other's following, but he says something to him in his cell. Of course, there's no audio, so you don't know what he said. You don't know if that was Childress or not. I mean, again, if you're believing the conspiracy, you see that as evidence of something. If you don't believe the conspiracy, you would see it and say that doesn't prove anything. The videotape is irrefutable. And the worst part of that videotape, I mean, imagining what was happening after the cutaway is obviously the worst part, but the worst part of what you see is just how the little girl's crying, and it's just, it's just heartbreaking. Well, and Marty pushed it, like, did you watch the whole thing? And Russ goes, yeah, just to see if anybody took their masks off. And he says, no, they didn't. He says, yeah, I had to see if they, it was a duty to watch that whole video.
It wasn't something he wanted to do. And I love the line where Marty says, you shouldn't have that, after he's convinced. And Rust is like, nobody should have this. I mean, what a great line.
It cuts to, well, it doesn't, at that point, Marty's convinced and he hires Rust as a partner in his private investigation firm that he's been running since he stopped being a police officer. People think like, well, why would they bother doing this? I'm like, well, they need an air of legitimacy. You can't just have like Rust, who's like a bartender doing random stuff. It's like, no, this guy used to be a former cop. Now he's working as a private investigator.
Or consultant or something like that, since he doesn't have a license. Like, he's operating under Marty's license as a consultant investigator.
It cuts to a scene where like Maggie and is asking about Rust from Marty. He's, well, how is he doing? And Maggie actually goes and sees Rust at the bar, and she starts trying to talk to him, and Rust wants absolutely nothing to do with her.
Yeah, he hasn't forgiven her, I don't think. That's how I interpret that. It's another subtle sort of like, he recognizes his own complicity too, and he understands why she did it, but he doesn't forgive her. So he has empathy, but no forgiveness. And so that's why he's kind of like sarcastic, but not entirely, when he says, you're classing up the joint, get out of here. It's interesting that, Rust doesn't let anyone off the hook for anything, but most of all himself. He's hardest on himself.
And you mentioned moments in this episode where Marty shows off a little bit of his investigating skills in terms of getting.
He's good, isn't he? I mean, he runs down all kinds of stuff, right? I mean, the methodology for finding that housekeeper was not talk to a CI who told me, he lays out a rather laborious route that he took to get to this person. And he was right. She was the housekeeper for Sam Tuttle, and they get an interview because of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. And she talks about, she mentions Childress too, right? And one of the boys with scars on his face, and they show her pictures of the twig, devil, I don't know, whatever you want to call them, right? Like the cult symbols.
Spooky sticks.
Yeah. And she starts talking about, she mentions the Yellow King and she mentions Carcosa. Mm-hmm. So she's seen this stuff firsthand, which is just further confirmation for Rust and Marty that, yeah, there's definitely, we got to find out where these people are, right? They decide that they're also going to kidnap Steve.
Well, they try to talk to him first, but Marty's approach doesn't work, and then Marty decides that we'll have to give Rust's approach a try, which goes to my point that I made before we went on air. We in our notes is that both of these guys are all in, like they are all in. Neither one of them are cops. Neither one of them has any authority to be doing what they're doing, but they are all in. Even Maggie can sense something about Marty when she says to him, or did you come here to say goodbye? And he doesn't answer her, but it's clear that maybe he did. He wanted to know what she told the cops too, but I think that was part of what he was doing. And the fact that, Rust doesn't care. Rust's been all in for a while, but now Marty's all in too. They're working out of his office, and he's busting his hump to do this. He's putting in the hours, doing some great investigative work independent of Rust. He's the one who has to go through all the files when he gets access to them, at the department by, using his contacts there. We see Marty as an actual talented investigator, but we also see both of these guys are just completely, they are all in. And that level of, like, remember when he shot Reggie Ledoux, what did Rust say to Marty? He said, good to see you to commit to something, and it was a bit of a jab, but it also shows a little bit of Rust's value system. Committing to something is something Rust values. And so, he talks about it before he goes undercover with the Iron Crusaders, how it has to be. And then again here, it's pretty much understood, and he goes for it, man. And Marty, to his credit, is right there. And then we get some buddy scenes, but they're still doing investigative stuff. So it moves the story forward. That's when, like, my favorite line of the episode happens, when they're talking about what other lives they might have lived or whatever. And Rust says how, life is barely long enough to get good at any one thing. And Marty's like, yeah, if that. And then Rust says, yeah, so be careful what you get good at. And that's right up there. Like, every episode has a great line like, the world needs bad men, Marty. We keep the other bad men from the door. That was a banger in that episode. And for me, this is probably the best line in the episode.
Well, I also like when Rust says, like, oh, maybe I would have been a historian or an artist. I'm like, yeah, I could see it.
Definitely,
for sure. Definitely an artist. Definitely an artist. I could totally see it.
That's funny because I think he'd be I think he would have been a great historian because he says something like bring a new perspective on old events or something like that. And that's what great historians do. So I think he would have been that character would have been a fantastic historian. After Marty's failure to get Garricky to tell the truth on the golf course, they, decide they're going to take him out on the boat. And Garricky gets kind of snitty with Marty when Marty brings it up again. And he says how he won't ask any more questions. But the problem is, I'm not going to ask any questions. He is. And then you see Rust with gloves on and a gun pointed at him. And that's where that, the Rust and Marty part of the episode ends.
Yeah. And then, yeah, you're right. And then it cuts to
Gilbo and Papania. Yeah.
Papania and Gilbo driving down the road and stop, and they talk to the man on the lawnmower and get directions from him to, I believe they're visiting the burnt out church that we saw in
trying to find it.
2, trying to find it. And we clearly see that the man they're talking to has scars on his face, and, he's respectful and he gives them directions. And we realize that man that they're talking to is the man that Rust was talking to at the school that Marty got agitated with, that he was continuing to talk to, and then was slowly...
They got the Ledoux information, and so he hit the horn. Yeah. I love how they shoot that scene where, like, he's backlit by the setting sun, by the sun that's low in the sky, and so as they kind of have a tracking shot that pans over, and you don't see the scars until the lighting changes, and Russ didn't see the scars because the guy was dirty and had scrubby, kind of beard too. And he wasn't that close either. But we know it's the same guy, like you said. And so now we know not only is Rust right, and Rust and Marty are on the right track, but this is the guy they're looking for, and going back to the boat, when they pull a gun on the sheriff, that's crossing the Rubicon right there. Like when I said they were all in before, this is proof of it, right? I mean, they still could have kept their investigation technically above board, even though they don't have a client exactly. But once they pull a gun on a law enforcement official, I'd say they're over the rise there at that point.
Well, I mean, how could they not be after watching what was on that tape?
Oh, sure, sure.
Some people would be like, you know what?
Too big for me. I'm out.
Too big for me. Like the state senators in this, the police department's in on this. Look at the sprawl, as Russ calls it. Like how many people are actually involved in this conspiracy? A lot of people would have looked at that and go, nope, not me. I don't feel like dying.
This will chew me up and eat me. Rust has nothing to lose. In fact, he pretty much tells Marty, if you notice, when they're in the office, he pretty much says in one of those scenes, yeah, I'm pretty much done. I'm going to kill myself, but I had unfinished business. So that's why I'm here. He puts it a little bit more eloquently than that. It's not as blunt, but it's pretty close. And so obviously when you're not afraid to lose everything, you're a pretty dangerous person. And Rust is all in and stop at nothing, but Marty's right there along with him. I mean, he still has a business and, standing, even if it's not as great as it once was. He's right there though. He believes in that duty and he's going to fulfill it right along with Rust. And so we have a great lead up to the final episode there with them pulling the gun on Garricky, and then the big reveal. I think I read, and you've done some reading about people's initial reaction. That might be another reason. Like some people did not like that reveal. They felt like it was contrived or whatever. I mean, did you come across any of that in your research?
I think some people thought it was kind of cheap because it's like, oh, it's the lawnmower guy. And it's like, he didn't have scars on his face. And so, well, no, he did. He just had a bit of facial hair. But if you go back, I suggest if you go back and rewatch that episode, you could tell that Russ almost immediately is not getting a good vibe off Childress right off the bat. And that's why Marty, and that's why I mentioned that scene. Marty is like, oh, we got the thing on Reggie Ledoux, and he's rushing him to get back to the car. And Marty's like walking as slow as he possibly can because Russ is walking as slow as he possibly can because I think Russ had a feeling that this guy had something was there. With, and he even talks about it. He goes, well, later in the series, he talked like we had him. We had him dead to rights.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's next episode. So I guess we'll dive into it deeper then. But what a wonderful callback to Marty's statement, early on to Papania and Gilbo when he was being interviewed about the detective's curse, how the answer for everything was right under your nose, but you were looking at the wrong things. I mean, he was talking about his marriage and stuff, but still, that's what happened in this case. They had it. The guy was right there under their nose and they weren't looking at him.
Exactly. And just so I liked how this episode ended. I liked it with the shot panning out and with it being revealed that this guy is the man with the scars on his face. So I quite enjoyed it. I liked
the stuff between Marty, the reunion of Marty and Rust and how they were able to work together again effectively. And I like to see the growth that took place in Marty, the fact that he was a much better detective in many ways. Like he was humbled a little bit and he was willing to dig into the files and dig into, minutia to much like Rust did years ago in order to get, some forward momentum on the case. So I thought it was a great episode. But there's only one episode left. Next week, we will talk about the episode 8, the finale, the season finale for season 1. We'll also briefly chat about seasons 2 and 3. Just a few thoughts there. We're not going to do a deep dive. Unless folks want us to move on to that at some point, we'd be thrilled to do that. And we're going to have a special guest for the last episode of this miniseries.
Fingers crossed that everything works out. Yes, a very special guest. You guys will probably be very familiar with them. I don't want to say it just in case stuff happens. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't want to give false hope, but yeah, very.
It's not Joe Rogan.
No, not Joe Rogan. I bet you Joe Rogan probably.
Don't get your hopes up.
Yeah, we're going to be doing the final episode, and I think it's going to be an interesting debate about the meaning of the final episode.
We shall see.
Journey. Well, yeah, we should see, guys. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. And we're almost at the end of the journey. I mean, man, we've talked about, we'll see how long next episode goes, but we've talked about True Detective for what? Almost 10 hours now?
Not as long as True Detective ran.
So, yeah, it's been quite a journey, guys. So I hope, look forward to, seeing you guys for the next episode. Okay. Have a good night.